Hey everybody, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, I think is what we always say on the webcast, depending on where you are in the world. I want to thank everyone for attending today, and it looks like we have an awesome crowd for today's presentation. A fourth part of a series we're doing on SQL Server 2008 and 2008 R2 end of support. Let me start with the obligatory talking about myself and introducing myself. My name is Dan Johnson. I'm a senior consultant here at Software One and specializing in Azure. As this slide shows a little bit about me and some of my more recent certifications and accreditations. I have almost 20 years in the IT industry. 15 of those were with Microsoft. First as a support escalation engineer supporting the Windows platform and System Center Operations Manager. And then later as a premier field engineer in the System Center space. Now I've been with Software One for almost 4 years and work with our customers on developing and implementing cloud strategies with platforms like Azure. And I also hold a number of Microsoft certifications as well as AWS, VMware, Veeam, Red Hat, and Commvault. So, you know, we've had, this is, like I said, this is a part four of a 4-part series. And then today, in part 4 today, what we want to focus on is if the decision has been made to move your SQL workloads to Azure, how do we go about doing that? You know, how do we evaluate our method and develop a migration strategy? And of course, how do these choices that we make during this evaluation process, how do they impact the SQL end of support, discussions that we've been having? So today we'll start with a recap of what we've been talking about through the whole series. I have a pretty detailed discussion after that about the 6 R's migration strategies, along with some pros and cons and some best practices, and then we'll tie it all up with a chart comparing each of these cloud strategies side by side. Okay, so let's recap the SQL end of support discussion. And you may have seen the slide earlier. I'm using it from a previous one of our previous webcasts, but it is a recap. So, why do you care about SQL end of support? Or why should you care about SQL end of support? And really, there's a lot of risk associated, and the key word here is risk, obviously, because it's big red letters here. The key word is risk because there's a lot of risk associated with doing nothing when end of support happens. So for security, for instance, if you're no longer getting security patches, that's a massive risk, especially when you're talking about databases. I mean, what could be more at risk than data that you have? I mean, that's why that's why you don't want to get compromised, right? You don't want to risk having your data or your servers that host your important data on your network become compromised. We also have regulatory compliance, and there's issues, and there's a whole lot of maybe hospitals or financial institutions that have regulatory compliance standards that say, if you have data in software or databases that are not current or not being supported, then they can fail an audit, just by having that data in non-supported environments. So there's certainly major compliance risk around the end of support of SQL here. And then licensing. There's a lot of risk around licensing because it's really easy to get SQL licensing wrong. We do a lot of advisory services, SQL advisory engagements to get people to get their SQL licensing in order. And it's easy to get it wrong, and getting licensing wrong can really limit your choices. For instance, if you don't have software assurance on your SQL 2008 servers, then you don't have upgrade rights, or you don't have license mobility to move that SQL workload to Azure. So the licensing risks is really around not getting it right and either being non-compliant or not having the rights to do what you need to do to remediate in your SQL situations. And then finally, a big area of exposure for risk is in the support area. If your databases are out of support, then you might find that some of your vendors of the applications that depend on your SQL backend may not support their installations because you're running your databases in an unsupported environment. So we really want to focus on these 4 items is why we're having this series on SQL into support, because it's all about the risk involved with not taking any action and why it's such an important topic to handle this end of support. So again, who is impacted by this? And I guess as you can tell, the picture suggests, it affects a whole lot of people. There's a lot of organizations that don't realize how many SQL in 2008 installs are out there. We have a lot of data around this. We have we have a SAM group, and using our SAM data, and we went to some of our partners who have massive amounts of data, and we found that around 43% of deployed SQL servers are still running on SQL 2008 or SQL 2008 R2. So, I mean, if that, number sounds familiar, you're not alone. I mean, this is what we keep hearing over and over again, that anywhere from 30% to half of the deployments in the customer environments are 2008. And that's, really what we're seeing across the board, whether, it's a small or a large organization. So, what are your options? So as you know, you can just upgrade, and you can pay for extended support, which is not cheap, or transform your workload. But what we really want to discuss today is that option to migrate your workload to Azure. And if you are going to migrate SQL into Azure, there are a bunch of decisions that have to be made when you move these workloads into Azure. Like, are you going to keep your SQL 2008 install as is, or upgrade, then move, or just migrate the data into some cloud native offering like an Azure SQL database or Azure Managed SQL instance? And there's definitely reasons to keep SQL 2008 in your environment, and why you might not upgrade or consolidate or decommission your existing 2008 workloads. Like maybe there's a feature in SQL 2008 that you need but was deprecated in later versions, or other reasons not to move away from it. And unless you want to pay for extended support, then it makes sense to take advantage of Microsoft's offer to get extended support at no cost for 3 years if you move that SQL server to Azure. So, when you're faced with the idea of keeping SQL 2008 and paying SQL extended support, which I think is like 3 times the cost of the license at this point, or getting it at no cost just by moving it into Azure, it really could make sense, particularly if you're already cloud focused or have that on the radar. So really the whole point of our discussion today is that Microsoft has this offer, but what if you don't have anything in Azure today, or you're not sure, what the thought process is when, going to the cloud? So let's form our discussion around what considerations there are when migrating to the cloud. And now, we always tell our customers, you don't move servers, you move workloads. You don't just move SQL to Azure. You have to move the whole application stack. So you have to really understand the impact, maybe the pros and cons and considerations of various decisions that have to be made during that migration process. And that's really what I do as a consultant with Software One, is I advise, plan, and transition our customers into Azure. And most of the workloads I work with are backed by SQL databases. I mean, that's a key option. So we tend to look at these and distributed applications and move them as such. So that was a little recap of why it's important and who it's affecting and what to do about it. But let's talk about, so maybe we're going to move to Azure. We've made that decision. Let's talk about some of the application migration strategies. And today, I'm going to focus on our discussion around a concept called the 6 R's. So if you're not familiar with R scoring or the 6 R's of migration, R scoring is a classification of a workload into maybe a level of effort bucket. What we need to do to get it into the cloud. How much effort is it going to take? And this was originally a Gartner construct, and they had the 5 R's of migration, and then the cloud vendors kind of got a hold of it and added a 6th R, which I think was the replatform there, which gives you some middle ground between rehosting and refactoring, but it also gives you the process a little bit more granularity. So when other people talk about this, you'll probably see 5 or 6 R score categories. And sometimes the names will change a bit, like replace might be referred to re-architect, and that doesn't really matter. I give some alternative names as I go through it, as you can see in the parentheses here. But really what's important, the thing that you need to know is that what's important is that you need to categorize your workloads so you know how much level of effort there is when you take your server or your workload to the cloud. In a nutshell, the 6 R's are retain, or as I sometimes like to say, revisit, because we may end up coming back to that later after changes or decisions have been made, but which basically retain just says leave the server as is, on premises, and do not migrate. And then there's retire, which is often called, which is the decommissioning process, or rehost, which is often called lift and shift. And then there's replatform, which can be considered a lift and shape. I like to call it lift and shape. Some people call it lift, tinker, and shift. And it's ultimately a rehosting strategy, but you have to make some changes to the server or servers in the process before you actually rehost them, rehost the updated server into the cloud. There was refactor, or sometimes called re-architect, which is strictly a development project, and we'll get into that in a minute. And then there's replace or repurchase, because you ultimately might be repurchasing into a different licensing model, like moving to a SaaS application. This is typically just moving to an as-a-service based model for that workload. All right, so let's start with some of the easiest ones here. The workloads, we're not going to migrate, like retain. So in this case, the customer is going to, keep the application or server in the source environment, at least for now. Like I said, we could be a revisit situation. This might be because it has an unsupported OS, an application, or the server may host legacy applications that don't have a business justification for migrating to the cloud. Of course, I sometimes call it revisit with this strategy because perhaps some of the replatforming, after doing some replatforming or refactoring changes or decisions are made, we may circle back around and create that business justification for migrating it to the cloud. But I would like to point out that this migration strategy comes with some risk, right? Particularly in the light of the discussion for SQL end of support. Because as we discussed earlier, if you do nothing and you're still running, SQL 2008, 2008 R2, and you're not getting the security patches, and you'll be less secure, or you're not maybe compliant because you don't have support or security patches, the licensing costs can go way up, and you may fall out of support for many of your other related products there. So you see, doing nothing in this case is really not really a choice to be had for SQL into support. And there's retire. Now this is a pretty valid choice after discovering and analyzing your environment. And when we go and work with customers, we use a number of discovery tools to help us figure out what's in the environment and help us kind of organize our migration plans. But here the application of the host is going to be decommissioned at the source location, at the on-premises data center. And sometimes after completing, our discovery phase, we find zombies that are running in the environment. And this is basically IT infrastructure that just isn't being used, and no one really knows about it. We'll discover all the servers on a number of subnets in your environment, and we'll go through them, and we'll find these servers that no one even knows existed because they've just been there and predate a number of the IT staff that's there now. So there's typically a good reason to retire them. Or we might find duplicate resources due to mergers and acquisitions or other reasons. And these might also just be resources that are part of an existing decommissioning program scope. And some other reasons for retirement is that the resources are just no longer needed because of cloud features that make servers irrelevant, or no longer needed because we no longer need maybe clustered hosts for DR purposes, or the alternative high availability hosts, because the cloud features that the cloud benefits of the cloud provide those benefits to us natively. So maybe a good reason to retire some of those. Again, this doesn't really forward our discussion with migrating to Azure, so let's kind of move on to some of those strategies where we're actually moving stuff. So now we have to look at and categorize what we are moving, right? So rehost, this is a good starting point, and this is your lift and shift of the workloads to Azure. These servers are typically capable of running in the target cloud environment without any significant amount of change. This is going to be a like-for-like application migration to the target cloud. And there's going to be minimal effort to make the application work on the target cloud infrastructure. So, and as I said, this is a very valid migration strategy in light of the SQL into support discussions, because if you can't or don't want to move away from SQL 2008, then you can just rehost your application as is into Azure, and Microsoft will provide that extended support at no charge for an additional 3 years. So not a bad deal, I think, and particularly if you have been looking at, moving to the cloud anyways. So what are our pros and cons around this migration strategy? Well, I just mentioned the Microsoft offer to get the free extended support that we already talked about, but the speed of migration, it's very fast, and there's typically a reduced risk of this type of migration. There's a number of tools available that natively support this migration strategy. For instance, Microsoft has a disaster recovery tool called Azure Site Recovery, which will allow you to make basically a carbon copy of your server into an Azure virtual machine. And this makes for a very effective migration tool. And these migrations can be automated. With these tools, they can be automated, and the migration will migrate the server with all of its current configuration settings. Now, some cons to this process, this strategy, is that the host is not OS agnostic. You're going to retain the same OS settings in the target environment. So if it wasn't an ideal setup in the first place, then you might consider making some changes through the replatforming process. You also do not get the use of Azure services that give you operational scale, like maybe Azure SQL database or SQL managed instances. So you're ultimately, obviously, you're getting a virtual machine and not some of those cloud native services. And additionally, you'll potentially inherit maybe some of the same application performance characteristics. If you've got a broken server, if it's broken before migrating, then, following the garbage in, garbage out philosophy, you're going to have a broken VM. It's going to have performance issues in the cloud. So, you want to make sure you have a healthy server when you do a lift and shift like this. And you don't get to retire much of the technical debt associated with it. So you're really just moving a VM from one data center into the cloud to another data center ultimately. There we go. Okay, so I always like to provide some best practices around each of these strategies. So for best practices around rehosting, they include you should evaluate and understand your infrastructure of your environment. You know, we use tools to help us discover and evaluate your on-premises workloads before transitioning them to the clouds. We really want to understand the picture before we move anything. And we want to utilize existing tools for the quicker migration into the cloud. You don't want to reinvent the wheel here. So just like Azure Site Recovery, there are a number of third-party disaster recovery tools that can help tremendously with this rehosting process. And we want to set up a migration factory. And some people say, what is a migration factory? Well, we want to get to a process down to where, you know, we want to usually get down to where we start moving some of your less critical or less complicated workloads first, while you figure out the process of moving and testing and committing to your move. And once you get this process worked out, we start to develop some kind of a migration cadence, and then we can kind of set up this factory of moving applications or workloads to the cloud with minimal effort and time. Of course, we want to test our migrations before doing the cutover. That should be pretty simple. And we want to challenge yourself to improve the architecture. Maybe rehosting is just a temporary stop on the way to developing your full cloud strategy. Maybe rehost, and then later we're going to optimize with some lower level, Azure services that'll give you more agility than you have with just the virtual machine. So replatforming, very similar to rehosting. It's you're going to make some changes here. So this would be where you require small amounts of change to the operating system, perhaps, or try to leverage some cloud efficiencies, perhaps like a PaaS instance of Azure SQL database. Typically, though, we're just up versioning of the OS and the database into the target cloud, or we're doing some level of application changes, upgrading to the latest release of the application. You might even be dealing with an application reinstallation on the target before you move it. It really kind of depends, but ultimately this isn't just a rehost. You can't just move it. You got to do some kind of changes in the process. That's why some people call it lift, tinker, and shift, or like I say, lift and shape. This could also include using Microsoft's database migration toolset. When you're talking about SQL, and we are today, Microsoft has a pretty robust migration toolset, including the Azure Database Migration Service, the DMS there, or the Data Migration Assistant. So those are two tools that we like to use when migrating just the data. So if we're moving maybe a SQL Server data into an Azure SQL database, we might just use one of those tools. So again, pros and cons. The pros here is you get the option to use cloud services that are very close to the existing infrastructure without requiring any code change. So that would be an example of just going to Azure SQL database or a web app or something like that. So something very similar to what you have, but you don't have to make any code changes in the process. You get the chance to upgrade to a newer operating system or SQL platform with better feature sets or performance characteristics. You also get the opportunity to utilize maybe modern operating system or database features or functionality that the cloud platform has to offer. And there are plenty of tools available to work with here, including the Azure Site Recovery, Azure Database Migration Service, or the Data Migration Assistant. If we were to put some cons to it, some replatforming projects may be more time-consuming and costlier than you might otherwise expect. So when you begin to start making changes, maybe things can sometimes get out of hand, so you need to watch that. It also requires, this process also might require both an existing and a new environment to run in parallel, at least for a short period of time. So if you're, lifting into and shifting into Azure, but it's not ready yet, and you need to make the changes after it moves, you might have to run it on premise while you make your changes in the cloud. And it will also require some additional planning and coordination than just the simple rehosting project we talked about before. So my best practices around this include you should certainly evaluate any code dependencies on the operating system or the SQL backend. If you're making changes to those, you need to make sure that any applications aren't going to be affected by that change that you're making. And you need to identify any of the modifications required in that code to port it to, onto the new operating system. Or you might even evaluate if porting would require any functionality trade-offs. So if you do make those changes, is there some functionality things that you're going to miss? And very important is you need to communicate any of these trade-offs to your user base and partners. And wherever possible, break up each of the functional components and test them individually. Consider your hybrid environment where you are, at least for a short period of time, working with an on-premises and a cloud environment, and plan your migration appropriately around that. And if the environments are running in parallel, consider maybe a DNS switch method post to success testing to make the cutover a bit bit simpler. Okay, so we start to get a little bit more complicated with our as we go on. It gets a little bit more complicated as we move into our other migration strategies, and certainly with refactoring, it gets ultimately, since this is typically a development project, because you're ultimately probably decoupling the whole application into individual services. And refactoring is a bit out of scope for this level of discussion, but for completeness of the 6 R's this topic, let's go ahead and hit it real quickly. So first of all, this is a development project. This method requires code changes or maybe even a complete rebuild of the application to maximize your cloud efficiencies. This will require middleware and applications to change to cloud service offerings like microservices, Azure App Service, or Azure Functions, or maybe even Azure Container Services. So you're really going to start utilizing a lot of those higher level services. And this may also include data conversion. So you may be a database transition to MySQL or another type of database target. So the pros and cons are pretty obvious here. We have an application. If you're rebuilding it, it gets a new lifeline, or we utilize native cloud features. And decoupling that application into a serverless infrastructure could provide increased efficiency, agility at agility at the improved cost. Additionally, the new cloud service could result in better customer experience than you had before, because you're getting a much more efficient application than you had before. Now the cons are it could be very complicated. This could require a lot of time and money and effort, and probably requires a very good understanding of all aspects of the application that you're moving, as well as compliance and regulatory and security and code design around it. And it could be very expensive, and the migration timelines could be extended, tremendously during the process here. So if I were to give you some best practices around this when refactoring, typically they revolve around development best practices, like you want to scope your refactoring initiative to meet a specific desired business outcome. You don't just want to make this a re-engineering project. You want to make sure that your code is working as expected, and you baseline your current functionality and features. So you want to make sure that you're getting better feature set and functionality than you had before you started the refactoring process. You also want to make sure you have some documented test procedures and tools and regular testing after each component of your code is refactored. And now this is a good opportunity to introduce good continuous integration and continuous deployment practice tools, and this would allow, for a quicker development, testing, and the rollback. So I'd break down when I would do this, I would break down each refactoring down into small projects. You want to make sure, ensure that the delivered code matches desired functionality here. And if you can use automated refactoring tools, if they're available, I would use them. For instance, if you're using, if your application's C++, consider using Visual Studio in this place. The final strategy here is called replace or repurchase, because ultimately you're going to repurchase into maybe a different licensing model. And this is typically, you're replacing your application with a SaaS-based offering or maybe a PaaS product. But, this is where, the application architecture, changes and may require up-versioning or porting or migrating the data to the new SaaS offering. So this typically would be a strategy where you would you'd want to go from Exchange on-premises or SharePoint installation to Office 365, or moving your ERP application to Dynamics 365, or even your CRM to Salesforce.com. You're going to move your data out of your data center and into this new SaaS application. But you would no longer have to administer the servers or the installed applications, but you'd still, maintain and retain that data that you have. So the pros around replacing, pros and cons, is the pros would be you'd get to eliminate any dependency on custom hardware or proprietary technology platforms. You're ultimately not going to be responsible for the hardware in this scenario anymore. And that's, because there is, replace strategy, there is no, infrastructure to maintain. And you truly will pay for what you use with this method. And the cons would be, and maybe this is even more of a best practice, but there should be a really careful evaluation of partners and vendors of your new SaaS-based offerings. I mean, you are in fact trusting them with the whole stack from hardware to application maintenance. And, some replace use cases grow in time and effort. So they may go from a replatforming and refactoring before moving into a replace strategy. So it may organically grow out of a different strategy altogether. And data migration is still required. So even if the replace is your strategy, so if you are migrating your data from your SQL databases into your SaaS application, then you need to make sure the tools and methods of migration are reliable and seamless to the end user. So my best practices around the replace strategy: evaluate your options, not just from the technical functionality perspective, but also consider integrations with the partners, the financial viability, and security and compliance and regulatory requirements around this. Make sure it's a good fit for your situation. Typically, you're going to build and run in parallel and identify options to keep data between the on-premises and the new systems in sync. So when we do projects like this, and a lot of times it's like an Office 365 migration, more than likely you're going to be running in a hybrid mode during the migration. So you have to keep all that data in sync. That would be the same for any product that you're moving to a SaaS application that requires you to run in a hybrid mode with a SQL backend as well. And then you want to test your functionalities in batches. Benefits features test them separately than maybe the sign-up features or the payroll features and stuff like and so on. And then you want to identify users, a user base that will be testing each of the functional components of the new system. And you want to migrate in batches as well and make sure that the users, the test users involved in each component, they understand the process for identifying and reporting any issues that they come across. So now let's tie it all together. And I went through all the 6 R's a little bit in detail. Might have gone a little quickly in some cases, but I kind of wanted to get through and give you an idea of what your options are when you're thinking of migrating your workloads, your SQL workloads in this case, to Azure. And I kind of want to, and then I put them on a chart here to give you an idea of how to identify the relative time and cost that each strategy would take comparatively, and what cloud agility benefits that each one is going to give you with that particular migration strategy. I also added a row here. I don't normally do, but I added a row here for this discussion. It gives you 1 or 2 words to take away from each of these methods that can help you with thinking about how each of these might affect SQL end of support that we've been discussing over the last 4 webcasts. So obviously, if you look at the chart, it takes no effort to do nothing and retain the servers, and slightly more effort to retire them. But of course, you're not going to get any benefits from the agility of modernization as a cloud service, because those are not migration processes. However, if you choose retain and you do nothing with your SQL 2008 R2 install, you can run into those security and compliance and licensing and support risks that we discussed throughout this whole series. So in this case, retain really isn't probably a strategy we want to work with here. And retiring really shouldn't have any effect on, other than maybe getting rid of some unneeded licenses. So there should be no impact in that case. Rehost. So rehosting could offer definitely would offer the most short-term benefits, as it's quick, easy, and of course, with the Microsoft extended support offer, helps mitigate all of those areas of risk exposure. So that's a really good, valid strategy to work with while you're deciding what your long-term cloud strategy is going to be. Replatforming, depending on what changes are made, would probably be an upgrade of the operating system or SQL or other applications. But if SQL 2008 is kept in this process, you could still benefit from that Microsoft extended support offer. And refactoring and replacing, they're going to be your strategies with longer term benefits. With refactoring you benefit from the cloud efficiencies of modernization and offloading the responsibilities of the operating system and the application administration. And with replace, it'll be more than likely just be a migration of your data to the SaaS vendor and a move from the perpetual licensing model to a per user subscription model. So as a follow-up to this SQL 2008 R2 end of support discussion today, we are offering at a no-cost assessment for our customers, SQL 2008 environments. The goal is to stop asking, have you addressed the SQL 2008 end of support issue, and start saying, let us show you what your risk is, and here is a process to remediate. So we can help you through that whole process, and we have this free assessment that we can offer. And all we need you to do is to run the free map, the Microsoft Assessment Planning Toolkit, which will provide a quick start. We can provide a quick start guide for, and using the map Excel reports, we can generate a custom one-page document, and this document can be leveraged to get buy-in from decision makers to take action on all of this risk that we've been talking about. So this is something we offer our customers in response to all of the end-of support issues. And of course, in my group, we are the services wing of Software One. So additionally, our services portfolio is quite extensive. We provide a process for taking you through the discovery and assessment of your environment, aligning your goals to the design and the transformation to Azure. And we have a wonderful support wing that you can use after we transition you over to Azure. So in case you have any issues going forward, you're not on your own. We have support services which have premier agreements with Microsoft. We can, if we have to get them involved because they ultimately own the platform, we can. So we provide that support as an offering as well going forward. And I'm as a future data center consultant, and with our Azure transitioning services, you'll get specifically designed solution that's aligned to your business goals, delivers IT solutions that match your budget, and we'll work with you on that and ensure that you get the most out of your Azure investment, both now and with your future plans. And we do this, of course, we do all of this through our unique and very effective delivery approach that we discussed in the previous slide. So I hope this discussion helped you find some of the methods to evaluate your cloud platform and your migration methods, and how there is an impact on the SQL into support. So let's take a look, see if there's any questions that have come in.
Hey, Dan.
Hello.
Yeah. So I was looking at the Q&A, and there were 2 questions that came through.
Good.
The first one is, you mentioned PaaS a few times. I get SaaS, but can you explain what PaaS is again?
So, yeah, and sometimes I guess I assume sometimes some of these lingo gets thrown around, but as you start looking at different methods of moving into the cloud, there are basically 3 levels of and everything's as a service nowadays. So the AS part is the as a service, but you have infrastructure as a service, which is a VM, which would be your rehosting and replatforming efforts. Typically would go into an infrastructure as a service, an IaaS. PaaS is kind of shaving away some of the responsibility of managing, certainly not to manage the operating system anymore, and you don't have to manage the installation of the application, but you still have to manage some of the configurations and the data and the users of the application. So platform as a service, PaaS, that's what it stands for, says really what I want is I don't want a virtual machine running SQL. I want a SQL database provider for me, so I can just connect to it through SQL Management Studio and manage the database. I don't want to worry about patching of the operating system or of the application itself. I want the cloud vendor to handle that. So all I need to handle is my data and the security around my data. So that's a platform as a service. And you said, of course, the user said SaaS, which is software as a service. That would be shaving away even more of the responsibility and handing it over to a vendor like Salesforce.com or Office 365, and you just have your email or your user data or your other data to deal with in that case. So platform as a service, PaaS, software as a service is SaaS, and there's typically a number of slides that can kind of graphically show you what those differences are. Hope that helped. Was there another one, Jason?
Yeah, there was one more. You mentioned software assurance in the beginning. Can you go over that again? And then I guess there's a follow-up question that said, I thought SA was really around upgrade rights.
Well, so software as assurance is kind of an additional licensing option. So if you have an enterprise agreement, you can purchase software assurance along with that. With the and it can be associated with your SQL installs or your operating system. But in the SQL instance, it gives you the upgrade right. So you have the ability, if you have software assurance, to go ahead and upgrade to the next level of the versioning with that, and it gives you other things typically in respect to the cloud, like license mobility, which would allow you to move the license that you're using on premises into a cloud like Azure or AWS. But with Azure, you also get a hybrid use benefit or hybrid benefit. I think they should call it hybrid benefit now, where you actually can use that license in Azure for your SQL server that's running in on a VM or even in an Azure SQL database. So that software assurance is an additional licensing mechanism that gives you some of those benefits of mobility and upgrade rights and things of that nature. Was there any other questions?
Yeah, one more just came through. You've been referring to Azure a lot. What about AWS?
Yeah, I mean, AWS, these certainly anything that we talked about in respect to the migration philosophy here. In fact, if you ever go listen to they use the 6Rs discussion all the time when they're talking about migrating to their platform. But all of this is pretty cloud agnostic discussion about how to evaluate your workloads that you're moving to Azure, to the cloud. I specifically said Azure in this case because we're talking about end of support for SQL, and it's a Microsoft discussion. But certainly, if you move, of course, I don't think you're going to get the free extended support if you move to AWS. Because Microsoft is encouraging you to move to Azure. So if you move to Azure, you get the extended support for 3 years with no cost. I don't think they'll offer that if you move to their competitor. But certainly any of the other discussions about the process of thinking about the workload and how you evaluate it and move it to your cloud platform would exist in either AWS or Azure or other cloud platforms.
Excellent. The rest of the questions I answered through the Q&A. So that's all the questions that we have. Thanks, Dan.
Well, great. Well, I certainly want to thank everyone for coming today. And this is if you know someone who wasn't able to make it, this is being recorded and will be shared out that they can look for it later and listen to it on demand. So I don't know if there's anything we need to tie up after this.
Nope, all good.
Thank you. All right. Well, thank you very much.